Manager panicked over the Millionaire's Mandarin. Then the black maid answered in perfect Chinese. The sweat dripped down Paul Lewis's face as he stood frozen in the middle of Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, watching $50,000 walk straight out the door. The Chinese billionaire Mr. Wong was shouting in rapid, furious Mandarin, his face red with anger, while Paul desperately tried to piece together broken phrases he'd learned from Google Translate just hours before. "Please, Mr. Wong," Paul stammered, butchering the pronunciation so badly that Wong's expression shifted from anger to pure disgust. The restaurant's crystal chandeliers seemed to shake with the tension as Wong's voice grew louder, his hands gesturing wildly at the disaster that was supposed to be the most important business dinner of Paul's career. Paul had worked 15 years to become manager of the Golden Dragon restaurant, and in less than 5 minutes, he was about to lose everything. The merger celebration that was supposed to cement his reputation was crumbling before his eyes. Wong's business associate stood behind him, equally frustrated, as Paul's pathetic attempts at Chinese only made things worse. "Bushing, Bushing," Wong shouted, shaking his head violently. Paul had no idea what it meant, but the tone said everything. The billionaire turned toward the exit, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor with finality. But then something extraordinary happened. From the corner of the restaurant, where she'd been quietly cleaning tables and going completely unnoticed by everyone in the room, a black woman in a simple uniform stepped forward. Jane Brown had been invisible to Paul and his staff for months, just another face in the background, someone they barely acknowledged except to give orders. "Wang Xiansheng," Jane said softly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. The entire restaurant fell dead silent. Mr. Wong stopped mid-stride, his mouth dropping open. Paul's eyes widened in absolute shock. The other Chinese businessmen stared in disbelief. Jane Brown, the cleaning lady they'd all ignored, was speaking perfect, fluent Mandarin. But here's what nobody in that room knew about Jane Brown, and what's about to blow your mind about this story, because this is just the beginning of the most incredible transformation you've ever seen. Let me take you back 3 hours before that shocking moment, to when everything seemed perfect in Paul Lewis's world. The Golden Dragon restaurant stood like a glittering jewel on Chicago's magnificent mile, where a single dinner could cost more than most people made in a week. This wasn't just any restaurant. This was where billionaires made deals, where celebrities hid behind velvet curtains, and where Paul Lewis had clawed his way to the top through 15 years of ruthless ambition. At 35, Paul was everything he thought success looked like. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, and an ego that filled the entire dining room. Tonight was supposed to be his masterpiece, hosting Mr. Wong's $50,000 merger celebration that would finally prove he belonged among Chicago's elite. "Everything has to be perfect," Paul barked at his staff, straightening his tie for the 100th time. "This is the biggest night of my career. Mr. Wong expects nothing but excellence." While Paul strutted around like a peacock, Jane Brown moved through the restaurant like a ghost. At 45, she had the kind of quiet dignity that comes from weathering life's storms without losing your soul. Her hands, worn from years of hard work, carefully polished each surface until it gleamed. Most of the staff barely acknowledged her existence, stepping around her like she was furniture. But if anyone had bothered to really look at Jane Brown, they might have noticed the small details that told a different story. The wedding ring she still wore, despite being widowed 2 years ago. The advanced linguistics textbook tucked discreetly in her cleaning supplies. The way her eyes lit up whenever she overheard conversations in different languages throughout the restaurant. "Jane, make sure you stay out of sight when the VIPs arrive," Paul said without even looking at her, his voice dripping with condescension. "We can't have the help cluttering up the dining room." Jane simply nodded and continued her work, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but a kind of patient knowing that Paul was too blind to see. The other staff members weren't much better. The servers whispered among themselves about Paul's big night, completely ignoring Jane as she cleaned around them. To them, she was just part of the background, as invisible as the wallpaper. Then Mr. Wong arrived, and Paul's entire world lit up like a Christmas tree. Wang stepped out of a black Rolls-Royce that probably cost more than Paul made in 5 years. He was everything Paul dreamed of becoming. Powerful, wealthy, and commanding respect wherever he went. At 62, Wang had built a tech empire that spanned 3 continents, and tonight he was celebrating the merger that would make him even more powerful. "Mr. Wang, welcome to the Golden Dragon." Paul practically bounced on his heels as he escorted the billionaire inside. "We are so honored to host your celebration tonight." Wang smiled politely, his English perfect but formal. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have heard excellent things about your establishment." For the first hour, everything went exactly as Paul had planned. Wang seemed pleased with the ambiance, nodding approvingly at the elegant decor and premium location. Paul was in his element, bragging to anyone who would listen about landing such an important client. "Do you see who I'm hosting tonight?" Paul whispered excitedly to his assistant manager. "Mr. Wang's merger deal is worth $300 million, $300 million, and he chose us for his celebration." Paul felt invincible. He strutted through the restaurant like he owned the world, already imagining the promotion, the recognition, the respect this would bring him. He was so caught up in his own success that he never noticed Jane Brown quietly working in the background, her expression thoughtful as she listened to snippets of conversation. What Paul didn't know was that Jane understood every word of the Mandarin phone calls Wang made throughout the evening. What he didn't realize was that his perfect night was about to become his worst nightmare, and the woman he dismissed as just the help was about to change everything. But Paul's perfect night was about to crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. It started when Mr. Wang opened the carefully crafted menu Paul had spent weeks perfecting. Wang's face darkened as he scanned the offerings, his polite smile vanishing like smoke. What Paul didn't realize was that he'd made catastrophic cultural mistakes that would insult any Chinese business leader. The menu featured dishes that were completely inappropriate for a business celebration, foods associated with funerals and bad luck that no respectable Chinese businessman would ever serve at a merger dinner. Even worse, Paul had arranged white flowers as centerpieces, the color of death and mourning in Chinese culture. It was like decorating a wedding with funeral wreaths. Wang's calm English began to crack as his frustration mounted. This is not correct," he said, his accent becoming thicker as his anger grew. "These foods at business dinner very bad." Paul's confident smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wang, I don't understand. These are our finest delicacies." That's when Wang switched to rapid Mandarin, his voice rising with each word. Paul stood there like a deer in headlights, catching maybe one word in 10, completely lost as Wang explained exactly how deeply Paul had insulted him and his business partners. "Please, Mr. Wang, I don't speak, could you?" Paul stammered, his face turning red as he realized he was drowning in front of Chicago's most important client. Then Wang's business associates began arriving, 5 more wealthy Chinese executives who took one look at the setup and immediately started speaking in concerned Mandarin among themselves. Paul watched helplessly as their expressions shifted from polite interest to barely concealed disgust. The situation in the kitchen was even worse. The head chef was frantically trying to prepare different dishes, but the ingredients Paul had ordered were all wrong. Hundreds of dollars worth of premium seafood sat unused because it wasn't appropriate for the occasion. The kitchen staff was in full panic mode, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. "We don't have the right ingredients," the chef shouted to Paul. "Everything you ordered is completely wrong for what they actually want." Paul felt sweat beading on his forehead as he ran between the dining room and kitchen, trying to put out fires everywhere. His 15 years of experience meant nothing when he couldn't even communicate with his most important client. Meanwhile, Jane Brown continued her quiet work, methodically cleaning tables nearby. But if Paul had been paying attention instead of panicking, he might have noticed how Jane's expression changed every time Wang spoke in Mandarin. How her eyes followed the conversation with understanding, how she occasionally shook her head slightly at Paul's fumbling attempts to respond. As the evening spiraled further out of control, Paul did what desperate people do. he started lashing out at everyone around him. "Why didn't anyone tell me this was wrong?" he shouted at his staff, his voice carrying across the dining room, where Wang and his associates could hear every word. "This is the most important night of my career, and you're all making me look like an amateur." The servers cowered under his verbal assault, their faces flushed with embarrassment as the wealthy Chinese businessman watched the spectacle unfold. Paul's professional mask had completely slipped, revealing the panicked, insecure man underneath. Jane, get over here and clean up this mess." Paul snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. "Can't you see we have important guests?" Jane looked up from her work, her dignity intact despite Paul's public humiliation. For just a moment, her eyes met Wang's across the room, and something passed between them, a flicker of understanding that Paul was too blind to see. Wang was now speaking exclusively in Mandarin to his associates, their voices growing more agitated by the minute. Paul could only stand there, watching his career implode in real time, completely unable to understand what they were saying about him. If you're enjoying this incredible story of what happens when assumptions meet reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what Jane Brown does next will absolutely blow your mind. The moment Jane Brown spoke those first words in perfect Mandarin, the entire restaurant held its breath. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. "Wang Shanshen," she had said, and suddenly every eye in the room was fixed on this woman, who had been invisible just seconds before. Mr. Wang slowly turned around, his expression shifting from anger to complete bewilderment. Paul's mouth hung open like a broken gate. The other Chinese executives exchanged glances of pure amazement. How was this possible? How did the cleaning ladies speak their language better than the restaurant manager who was supposed to be hosting them? Jane stepped forward with quiet confidence, her cleaning cloth still in her hand, and continued speaking to Wang in flawless Mandarin. Her pronunciation was perfect, her tone respectful but assured. She wasn't just speaking Chinese, she was speaking it like someone who understood the nuances, the cultural weight of every word. Wang responded immediately, his anger melting into curiosity as Jane listened intently to his concerns. Then she turned to Paul, who was standing there looking like he'd just witnessed a magic trick. "Mr. Lewis," Jane said calmly, "Mr. Wang is upset because the menu you've provided is entirely inappropriate for a business celebration. In Chinese culture, the foods you've selected are associated with mourning and bad luck. The white flowers on the tables represent death. You've essentially created a funeral dinner for what should be a celebration of new beginnings." Paul's face went pale. I had no idea. I thought. But Jane wasn't finished. She turned back to Wang and spoke again in Mandarin, then translated for Paul. "Mr. Wang also says that your inability to communicate with him directly shows a lack of respect for his culture and his business. In Chinese business culture, the host should at least attempt to bridge the language gap." The room was still frozen in shock. How was this happening? How did Jane Brown, the woman they'd all ignored and dismissed, suddenly become the most important person in the room? The answer lay in a story that nobody in that restaurant knew. A story that began 5 years earlier when Jane's life was completely different. Dr. Jane Brown had once stood in lecture halls at Northwestern University teaching advanced linguistics to graduate students. She had a PhD in applied linguistics with a specialty in Sino-Tibetan languages. Her students adored her, her colleagues respected her, and her research on cross-cultural communication was published in academic journals around the world. Jane had met her husband Michael at the university. He was a professor of literature, and together they'd built a beautiful life filled with books, travel, and intellectual curiosity. They'd spent summers in Beijing, where Jane perfected her Mandarin and fell in love with Chinese culture. She could discuss philosophy in Mandarin, negotiate business deals, even understand regional dialects that most foreigners never mastered. But then the budget cuts came. Northwestern eliminated her department, and despite her credentials, academic jobs were scarce. At 50, starting over was harder than she'd imagined. Then Michael was diagnosed with cancer, and their world collapsed completely. The medical bills were staggering. Insurance covered some of it, but the experimental treatments that gave Michael an extra year of life cost them everything. Their savings, their house, their comfortable middle-class existence. Jane took any job she could find to pay for his care, swallowing her pride and accepting work that paid the bills. When Michael passed away 2 years ago, Jane was left with nothing but debt and grief. The cleaning job at Golden Dragon paid enough to cover her small apartment and her late husband's remaining medical bills. She took it with dignity, because work was work, and she had learned that there was honor in any job done well. But Jane never stopped learning. During her breaks, she'd study advanced Mandarin business terminology on her phone. She'd listen to Chinese financial news podcasts while she cleaned. She understood every conversation the Chinese businessmen had in the restaurant, heard every cultural nuance, caught every subtle insult when things went wrong. Now, as she stood between Paul and Wang, Jane wasn't just translating words. She was bridging two completely different worlds. "Mr. Wang," Jane said in Mandarin. Mr. Lewis meant no disrespect. American business culture often overlooks these important details. He's actually quite dedicated to making this evening perfect for you. Then she turned to Paul. "Mr. Lewis, Mr. Wang appreciates effort over perfection. If you can show him that you're willing to learn and adapt, he'll respect that more than if you had gotten everything right by accident." For the first time all evening, both men looked like they might be willing to listen instead of walking away. Jane Brown had just done something extraordinary. She'd taken a disaster and turned it into an opportunity for understanding. But what happened next would change not just this one evening, but the entire trajectory of everyone's life in that room. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. Jane didn't just translate, she transformed the entire evening. Working quickly but thoughtfully, she helped Paul understand exactly what needed to change to honor Chinese customs properly. Out went the white flowers, replaced with red and gold arrangements, symbolizing prosperity and good fortune. The menu was completely redesigned around dishes that celebrated new beginnings and successful partnerships. But here's what made Wang truly impressed. Jane didn't just know the language, she understood the soul of Chinese business culture. She explained to Paul that in Chinese tradition, the host's willingness to adapt and learn was more valuable than getting everything perfect from the start. It showed respect, humility, and genuine desire to build relationships. In Chinese business, Jane told Paul as they worked together to fix the evening, relationships matter more than transactions. Mr. Wang isn't just buying dinner, he's investing in trust. Paul found himself in the strangest position of his life, taking guidance from a woman he'd barely noticed for months. And for the first time, he really looked at Jane Brown. Not as the cleaning lady, but as a person. A person who was solving problems he couldn't even identify, speaking languages he couldn't understand, navigating cultural complexities he didn't even know existed. As the evening progressed, Paul watched Jane work with growing amazement. She spoke with Wang's business associates like she'd known them for years, discussing everything from market trends to philosophical concepts. These weren't simple conversations. This was sophisticated, high-level communication that required deep cultural knowledge and linguistic mastery. Wang pulled Paul aside during dinner, speaking in careful English. "Your colleague, she is very impressive. Where did you find someone with such skills?" Paul's face burned with shame as he realized he had no idea. He'd never asked Jane about her background, never wondered about her education or experience. He'd seen the uniform and made assumptions that were completely wrong. The merger celebration became everything Wang had hoped for, and more. His business partners were delighted with the culturally appropriate menu, impressed by the thoughtful attention to Chinese customs, and amazed by the seamless communication that Jane had made possible. Deals were discussed, partnerships were formed, and the $50,000 evening became the foundation for millions in future business. But the biggest transformation was happening inside Paul Lewis. "Jane," he said quietly as the evening wound down, "I owe you an apology. I've been completely blind. I'm sorry for how I treated you, how I spoke to you. You saved my career tonight, and I don't even know how to begin thanking you." Jane smiled, not with triumph, but with grace. "Everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, Mr. Lewis. Sometimes it just takes the right moment." That's when Mr. Bright Wong approached Jane privately with an offer that would change everything. "Miss Brown," he said in perfect English, "my company is expanding our American operations. We need someone who understands both cultures, someone who can bridge the gap between East and West. Would you consider joining us as our cultural consultant and communications director?" The salary he offered was 3 times what Jane made cleaning the restaurant. More than that, it was a chance to use her real skills again, to be valued for her knowledge and experience. But Jane looked at Paul, who was standing nearby listening to every word, and made a counterproposal. "Mr. Wang, I'm honored by your offer. But I think there might be an even better arrangement. What if I worked with both of you? I could help Mr. Lewis build the Golden Dragon into a truly international restaurant and consult with your company on cultural communications. Chicago's business community needs more bridges between cultures." 6 months later, the Golden Dragon restaurant looked completely different. Jane Brown, now the Director of International Relations, sat in her office reviewing partnership proposals from businesses across Asia. She wore a sharp business suit, her intelligence finally visible to the world, her talents finally recognized. In the corner of her office, Paul Lewis sat with a Mandarin textbook, struggling through basic phrases, while Jane patiently corrected his pronunciation. The man who had once dismissed her was now her student, learning not just a language, but a whole new way of seeing the world. "Ni hao, Jane Lao Shi," Paul said carefully, using the respectful term for teacher. Jane smiled. "Much better, Paul. You're learning that respect begins with effort." The Golden Dragon had become Chicago's premier destination for international business dinners, hosting executives from around the world. Paul's arrogance had been replaced by humility, his assumptions challenged by curiosity. He'd learned that leadership meant recognizing the value in everyone around you, not just the people who look like success. And Jane? Jane had learned that setbacks weren't endings. They were just detours that sometimes led to even better destinations. This story reminds us that every person we encounter has depths we can't see from the surface. The janitor might be a former CEO. The cashier might be a published poet. The cleaning lady might be a linguistics professor who speaks 5 languages fluently. We live in a world where people's circumstances don't always reflect their capabilities, where economic necessity sometimes hides extraordinary talent. Jane Brown's story is a reminder that dignity isn't determined by job titles, intelligence isn't measured by paychecks, and the most important conversations we have might be with the people we're most likely to overlook. The next time you interact with someone whose job might seem ordinary, remember Jane Brown. Remember that behind every uniform, every service role, every person working hard to make ends meet, there might be someone with knowledge, skills, and wisdom that could change your entire perspective. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.